Eli here, and today I want to talk about the path that grinding gear is taking towards their balancing philosophically and what they've implemented a little bit, just to present a different way that we could see the game get balanced that could allow for more build diversity and taking advantage of mechanics that really aren't being used to the extent that I think that they could. First, a quick recap of where I think we are right now. Grinding Gear in this latest patch has decided that we deal too much damage. The player power creep has gone too out of control, so we're going to bone flask charges and we're going to nerf all of the straight more damage multipliers on gems, making them have actual drawbacks like controlled destruction, or sometimes just you just have a less more multiplier, and that's just what the nerf is. What this does is this is just a hard pullback on our damage potential, which isn't really fun or interesting. I understand where Grinding Gear is trying to go. They're trying to reshape the game a little bit in how we play it and what we do, and I get that. Details aside, philosophically, I get that and mostly agree. The problem is, and I'm not the first person to say this, that the whole game is designed around, to this point anyway, either you delete the screen or the screen deletes you. And because the game is designed around this, if you do a hard pullback like they did on both our strongest defensive layers, like flasks, being able to make us curse immune, for example, and also pull back on our damage output, you are double whammying our ability to play the game as it's currently designed. This pulls back on potential build diversity, which doesn't feel good, and the builds that we already like aren't as effective, which doesn't feel good. And then certain builds that are good regardless, like minions, for example, are just always going to be strong. So the builds that we expect to work continue to work, and all of the builds that we want to work don't. Now, I'm not here to just shit on GGG and talk about how bad they are. I want to present a alternative solution using mechanics that we already have in game that Grinding Gear feel like just shouldn't be used to their full potential. And that's kind of putting words in their mouth. What I mean is the way these things are implemented right now, we can't utilize them to an interesting degree. And what am I referring to? Some of you may have already guessed it: ailments. And not damaging ailments. Those aren't really that interesting. It's just to, build up a massive amount of poison damage or hit really strong ignites by scaling through more multipliers. Either way you cut it, it's all just more multipliers, and that's not super interesting. If Grinding Gear wants to change the way their game is played and allow for stronger build diversity, in my opinion, they should explore the non-damaging ailments a little bit more. Let's take Shock, for example. Shock allows you to increase the damage that monsters take by up to 50%, up to a 50% more damage multiplier. That's pretty cool in theory. However, the only monsters that you can really achieve high levels of shock against are monsters that are going to just be obliterated anyway with the damage that it currently takes to achieve that level of shock. So I'm talking about, trash mobs, most rare mobs, this kind of thing. Where you'd really want shock to be effective and valued and used would be on higher level league content and bosses. The problem is right now, in order to achieve really high levels of shock, like above 30%, you would simultaneously somehow need to scale your damage to the maximum degree that you can, while also scaling shock effectiveness. And because of the way Path of Exile is made and the way it's correctly made, you can't simultaneously invest in all of these things. Your resources for investment are limited in terms of what affixes can go on gear and how many talent points you have and all this stuff. Now, I'm going to speak mostly philosophically about these proposed changes and this proposed path of opening up build diversity because I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty details of hypothetical numbers. That's not something that I think would be beneficial for anybody, but the point is, what I'd like to see is 50% shock be something that is achievable by certain builds. And then from there, having achieved maximum shock value against an enemy gives the player some kind of bonus. Not necessarily more damage on top of it, but something else. Maybe it borrows a little bit from sap and makes them deal a little bit less damage, or maybe it just straight stuns them for a second once you hit maximum shock. So as you're dealing damage up to that 50%, you're progressively dealing more to this monster until you hit the cap, and then they get stunned, which allows you free damage, which is always great. But then perhaps the unique monster or the monster that's rare and really powerful or whatever it is gets some kind of partial immunity or resets the shock value or something like this, where there's an event that triggers that you as the player have to then deal with. So yes, you've dealt progressively more damage to this monster. You've then stunned them. However, because this monster is strong enough that you can even reach this threshold in the first place, they get some kind of a counterplay. So maybe they get hit by all this lightning damage, so they get charged up and they gain extra lightning damage on their hits for a little bit. Or maybe a lightning storm cascades from outward from them, so you have to move out of the way or be ready to use a movement skill to dash into a safe zone or through it or something like this. Not only would this kind of gameplay reward you for investing in non-damaging ailment effectiveness, it would also make the Overshock Cluster Jewel mean anything at all, as right now it's completely useless, but it would also open up potential build diversity and a bit of a modification to potential gameplay loops. Imagine a Flicker Strike melee who is just progressively dealing more and more damage to a boss and happens to evade some hits, and then eventually they get stunned, so the boss continues to take a little bit more damage, but then the melee player has to dash out and get ready for the lightning storm or get ready for it to counter hit or something like this. It doesn't have to be a necessarily super complicated gameplay loop, but something a little bit different than if I stand still, I'm dead. Now, I think this entire line of logic applies to chill and freeze as well. If you can apply a higher chill than 30% or 40% if you're an elementalist to boss monsters or really strong rares or what have you, being able to slow them down this much could also open up potential build diversity for builds that really need monsters to be slow enough that they can't move around the screen that much for a short period of time. Again, this is the kind of thing where once you hit certain thresholds, the monster should have some kind of built-in innate ability to react to the fact that they are so severely slowed. Or maybe there's, if you're freezing, then a certain duration happens where they've been frozen for 2 seconds or something like this, and there's something well signaled and well telegraphed that their frozen body is going to, the encasement's going to explode out in a bunch of ice shards, and you have to deal with that. Maybe those ice shards chain off walls, and so you have to deal with that kind of thing. My problem overall with non-damaging ailments as they are is that they just aren't interesting. Shock is just a little bit of a more multiplier, usually something around like 14% on a monster like Cirrus if you're dealing quite a bit of lightning damage. And chill, boss monsters are just a little bit slower. It's not really changing the dynamic of the fight. It's kind of a defensive layer, but not really. Because if you're hitting them hard enough to chill that much, you're probably winning the fight anyway, with or without them moving just a little bit slower or not. And this also isn't touching on the alternate non-damaging ailments like Brittle and Sap and Scorch. Just off the top of my head, maybe with Scorch, once you reach a certain threshold or a duration of them being scorched, maybe they get covered in ash, and now that monster is, for the duration of their life, now permanently covered in ash. That's a cool buff. Maybe on that same line with Brittle, maybe you can hit them so hard or with enough effectiveness on Brittle to make it so that you kind of apply additional debuffs, where for a period of time they have just an increased chance to be crit on top of additional Brittle effects. And then with Sap, we have kind of the same idea. You can get up to 20% less damage taken from the monster. Okay, that's all right. Why not make it like 50%? Why not allow players to go this route of taking an alternate non-damaging ailment and buffing it up to the point where their character, who maybe is a slow bonker or something that actually wants to tank things, now if you apply this debuff properly, maybe you can get to that point where you could actually sit still and tank things. Because right now in Path of Exile, either you are tanking things because you are invincible, or you have multiple layers of dodge and block and evasion, and probably maybe a lot of regen or some way to regain percentages of your health when you block, for example, or you're not tanking. And the thing is, I understand that non-damaging ailments are really potentially powerful. Yes, freezing something is really strong. And chilling something 70%, like I've suggested, is really powerful. Shocking something for 50%, yeah, really strong. That's the point of the game. The point of the game is to be able to make builds that go in strange routes to achieve the same goal of winning, of beating the fight. Right now, your only option is to scale as much damage as possible. And yeah, defensive layers are really important, but they are certainly not all created equal. Armor and evasion are both kind of bad defensive layers because they don't stand on their own. If your only investment in defensive layers is really high evasion, it will be useful, but it doesn't do anything for spells, and you will eventually get hit. And if you're pushing tier 14 through 16 maps and higher in content, when you get hit, you are probably going to die in this scenario if that's your only defensive layer. Dodge and block are good on their own. They stand well on their own because there is no entropy roll associated with it, like with evasion, meaning you can block over and over and over. But again, there's really only two major ways to get really high block and spell block, and this is through being a gladiator or getting glancing blows, which helps you and hurts you. So really, dodge is the best effective layer, but it also has drawbacks for other things that you can't use with it, like energy shield. And I get that you can use energy shield technically, but it hurts you a lot. And then armor. Armor is just kind of a joke unless you take it to extreme levels and use timeless jewels. So anyway, that's my rant. That's the direction I'd like to see Grinding Gear use. I think they have systems in place that could just be so much more interesting than they already are. And instead, we are pigeonholed into this, well, we're going to hard pull back on your potential damage output, and damage output is the only route that you can take. You must have a certain threshold of more multipliers and increased multipliers. Otherwise, you just can't do content. You just can't do it. So if there were other routes to allow different types of builds that were maybe slower, like having the ability to chill really effectively or freeze really effectively, and allowed you to do things that you otherwise can't because you always have to be moving and always have to be casting and always dealing damage at all times simultaneously, then that would make me happy. All right, rant over. That's it for now. If you like this, hit like, hit subscribe. We're close to 1,000. It'd be tight if we got there pretty soon. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your dog, whatever. Until next time, this is Eli, signing off.